What would you choose if life handed you everything? Wealth, power, and a future already scripted, yet left your heart completely empty. Ethan Whitmore had it all: a penthouse in Manhattan, a $1 billion company, and a fiancée who defined high society. But beneath the polished surface, he lived like a stranger in his own life. Then came a business trip to Iceland, a land of fire and ice, and with it, a quiet assistant named Claire Bennett. She wasn't chasing power. She wasn't dazzled by his world. She carried only a worn leather portfolio, a heart burdened by her father's failing health, and a kind of courage Ethan had never known. Trapped in a snowstorm, standing between duty and desire, they were forced to confront questions neither had dared to ask. Is love worth risking everything? Can two lives from opposite worlds ever truly belong together? This is a story of storms, choices, and a love that rewrote the future. If this journey moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the story begins now. Ethan Whitmore had everything a man was supposed to want: a penthouse above Manhattan, a company that dominated headlines, and a fiancée whose name opened every door. Yet, every morning, as the city woke below his windows, he felt like a guest in his own life. The glass walls of his home stretched floor to ceiling, offering a sweeping view of the skyline. The Hudson shimmered in the distance, ferries cutting across the water like tiny silver fish. From 40 stories up, the chaos of Manhattan seemed silent, reduced to the flicker of headlights and the faint hum of traffic. To anyone else, it might have looked like power. To Ethan, it felt like glass between him and the world. His mornings followed a script: the alarm at 5:30, the treadmill, 10 miles exact, heart rate measured by a wrist monitor that never left his arm. Breakfast was a bowl of steel-cut oats weighed to the gram, berries lined in rows that looked almost military. A protein shake sat beside it, frothless, dull, efficient. He ate without tasting, reading emails that arrived overnight from Tokyo, London, Oslo. His calendar was a wall of color-coded blocks, each minute accounted for, as if freedom itself was a luxury he could no longer afford. At 6:45, he tied his Italian shoes, pulled on a tailored suit, and reviewed the day's agenda. Investors at 9, legal review at 11. A call with Washington regulators after lunch. By evening, he would be at a charity gala, shaking hands beneath chandeliers, smiling for photographs that would appear in financial magazines by morning. Every step rehearsed, every smile calculated. People called him disciplined, admirable, some even whispered enviable. Ethan knew the truth. Discipline had hardened into a cage. He had not spoken to his parents in 2 years. Their calls came less often now, reduced to holiday voicemails he never returned. He had not sat through a dinner without a phone in hand since before North Shore Energies went public. Love, friendship, even sleep, everything came second to the empire he had built. And though the empire glittered, it left him with nights that felt hollow, mornings that felt borrowed. A buzz broke the silence. His phone lit up with a name he could not ignore. Celeste Harrington. Celeste, his fiancée, was a force. Blonde, poised. Her face appeared in glossy magazines. Her voice carried weight in boardrooms. She had a gift for shaping stories, spinning perception into influence. For 3 years, she had been Ethan's partner in what the world saw as a perfect match. Power with power. Brand with brand. Their engagement had been announced with a press release, their photographs curated like campaign posters. Her text flashed on the screen: chapel fittings. Photographer confirmed. Be on time this week, Ethan. There was no good morning, no question of how he had slept, just the schedule, polished and precise. He read it twice, then set the phone down. The ring on her finger had been chosen by her publicist, not by him. Sometimes he wondered if she cared about the man, or only the story. He brushed the thought away. There was no space for such doubts. Not today. Today, he prepared for Iceland. North Shore Energies had been negotiating for months with the Icelandic government. A groundbreaking project that promised to harness geothermal power, on an unprecedented scale. Billions hung in the balance. Contracts, politics, the future of clean energy all converging on one frozen island in the North Atlantic. It was supposed to be routine. His senior assistant, Leonard, had arranged everything down to the last coffee break. Leonard was unshakable, efficient, a man who seemed bred for boardrooms. But that morning, Ethan's chief of staff appeared in his doorway with a face pale as paper. "Leonard won't make the trip," she said quietly. "His wife was in a car accident last night. He's at the hospital. They expect him to be there for weeks. For the first time in years." Ethan's routine faltered. "No?" Leonard, he asked, almost to himself. Meetings in Reykjavik, tours of geothermal fields, dinners with ministers. Leonard knew his rhythms, his tells, the 1,000 invisible threads that held his empire steady. Without him, Ethan felt exposed. The chief of staff hesitated, then slid a folder onto his desk. "We've assigned someone else? She's been preparing for weeks, just in case." He frowned. "Who, Claire Bennett?" The name meant nothing. Ethan flipped the folder open. A resume, notes in tidy handwriting, flight confirmations, cultural research. He scanned, but his mind caught on a single detail written in bold at the top, acting assistant for Iceland trip. "Claire Bennett," he repeated. The syllables felt foreign in his mouth. A stranger, stepping into the tightest circle of his life. He closed the folder and leaned back, staring out at the city again. 5 days. He could manage 5 days. Yet, as he set the folder aside, something unexpected stirred. Not fear, not annoyance. Something else, faint but insistent, like the first tremor before a storm. 5 days, he murmured, nothing more. But deep inside, a question he had buried for years pressed forward. What if 5 days could change everything? The first time Claire Bennett stepped into Ethan's glass-walled office. She carried no trace of nerves, no hint of ambition. Only a worn leather portfolio and a quiet steadiness that seemed almost out of place in a world of steel and speed. She was 35, though there was a softness in her expression that made her seem younger, and a gravity in her eyes that made her seem older. Claire came from Vermont, a town where people still left their doors unlocked, and where autumn painted the hills in colors city dwellers rarely believed were real. She had once taught literature at a community college, guiding students through Whitman and Frost, coaxing them to listen for the heartbeat in poetry. But life had its turns. When her father's heart failed, she had traded classrooms for hospital waiting rooms, and eventually for jobs that paid the bills with less joy but more stability. Now she stood before Ethan Whitmore, a man whose name carried weight on Wall Street, her dark hair tied back, her gray blazer neat but not new. She didn't fidget. She didn't try to fill the silence. She simply opened the portfolio and began. "I've prepared a cultural analysis of Iceland," she said, her voice even clear. Her fingers turned pages filled with tidy notes, maps, highlighted passages. Their business etiquette favors humility. They distrust flash. Meals are often working meals, but they prefer sincerity over spectacle. Weather patterns this week suggest travel delays are possible, so I've outlined contingency schedules. Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms folded, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had expected hesitation, perhaps flustered eagerness. Instead, she moved with quiet certainty, like someone who had already lived through harder rooms than this one. "Risks?" he asked. She nodded. "The geothermal fields you'll tour are active. I've confirmed safety protocols. I've also arranged for medical contacts in Reykjavik. Should anything occur, small details, but small details matter." He watched her without speaking for a moment. Claire Bennett was not Leonard. Leonard had carried a sharpness, a rhythm that matched Ethan's own relentless pace. Claire carried something different, a calm, like a stone settled in a river while the water rushed around it. On his desk, his phone buzzed. He glanced. Celeste. Again. The message was as polished as it was pressing venue decision due today. Tuscany or Napa? Magazine wants exclusive photos. Another buzz followed before he could lock the screen. "Don't make me chase you." This affects both our brands. Ethan pressed the phone face down on the mahogany desk. His temples throbbed with the silent reminder of the double life he lived one, of boardrooms and contracts, another of photo shoots and curated appearances. Celeste fit perfectly into the latter. But in this moment, as Claire laid out itineraries with hand-drawn notes on cultural nuance, the contrast felt almost jarring. She pushed a document across to him. Here are briefing notes on Minister Janssen. He's fond of American jazz, particularly Coltrane. A mention could ease the opening conversation. He lifted his eyes, surprised. How did you find that? It was in an old interview, buried in an Icelandic newspaper archive. She said it without pride, without showmanship, simply fact. For a long breath, Ethan studied her, not conventionally beautiful in the way glossy magazines trained men to expect, but composed, genuine, unpolished in a way that felt almost radical. She wasn't here to impress him. She wasn't even here, it seemed, to advance herself. She was simply present. The silence stretched, broken only by the muffled hum of the city beyond the glass walls. Finally, Ethan spoke. This trip carries billions in negotiations. One error, one oversight, and it could unravel everything. If you come, there is no margin for mistakes. Claire met his gaze steadily. I understand. Do you? His voice carried the sharpness of a man accustomed to dominance. This isn't an academic exercise. These are heads of state, CEOs. They won't forgive errors. She didn't flinch. I understand, she repeated. That's why I've prepared for every scenario I could think of. She paused, then added, I don't intend to replace Leonard, but I can do what needs to be done. Ethan felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Respect, perhaps, or curiosity. He wasn't sure which unsettled him more. Another vibration from his phone. He didn't look. He closed the portfolio, fingers brushing against the worn leather. A teacher-turned-assistant, a daughter who had carried her father through illness, a woman who did not posture, who did not push. He exhaled, slow. Very well. You'll come. The weight of his own words surprised him. Decisions in his world were transactional, calculated. This one felt different, almost instinctive. Understand this, he added, his voice quieter now, but edged with steel. If there is risk, you don't take it. If there is uncertainty, you eliminate it. Your margin for error is zero. Claire inclined her head, not deferential, not intimidated, just steady, understood. And in that brief nod, Ethan caught something he hadn't seen in years. Not ambition, not fear, something else. A quiet, unshakable trust. At 30,000 feet, with Manhattan fading behind them and the North Atlantic stretching ahead, Ethan realized he had never spent more than a few hours beside Claire. Now, 14 hours lay between them and Iceland. The cabin of his private jet hummed with a low steadiness, the kind of sound that usually calmed him. Tonight, it felt louder than usual, filling the space between him and the woman across the aisle. She sat with her legs tucked neatly, a worn paperback resting in her hands. The cover was faded, the corners bent, the spine cracked from years of use. Ethan glanced at the title, Collected Poems of Emily Dickinson. Not a corporate manual, not a policy report. Poetry. He was almost startled by the sight of it here, in a world that measured time in contracts and stock prices. Claire's lips moved silently over the words, as though she was listening to them more than reading them. Every now and then, she underlined a phrase in pencil, her handwriting small, careful, almost reverent. He cleared his throat. Poetry. She looked up, not flustered. It helps me understand people, Dickinson especially. She noticed the things others overlooked. Ethan nodded slowly but didn't reply. He shifted his gaze toward his laptop. Though the financial models on the screen blurred, his curiosity stayed with her, quietly tugging. Hours passed with only the murmur of engines and the occasional clink of glasses from the attendant. Claire switched from the book to a set of notes she had written by hand. Her pen moved steadily across the paper, listing tasks, deadlines, questions. Her focus was precise, almost stubborn. Finally, she leaned back, removing a pair of small earbuds. A faint trace of sound escaped country music, gentle, unhurried. Ethan tilted his head. Country. She smiled faintly. It's what my dad likes. I grew up with it. Feels like home. The mention of her father hung between them. She didn't rush past it, didn't soften it with small talk. Instead, she set her pen down, folding her hands in her lap. He's waiting for a transplant, she said quietly. Heart. He's been on the list for months. His doctors want to prepare him for an LVAD if things decline further. That's a mechanical pump. Keeps the heart going while you wait. Her tone was steady, almost clinical, but Ethan noticed the way her fingers pressed together, the faint tremor in her left hand. I work, she continued, to keep the insurance. It covers more than any other option he has. She glanced at the papers in front of her, then gave a small, apologetic shrug. That's why I'm here. Stability matters. Ethan felt the words strike somewhere deeper than expected. He shifted in his seat, staring at the glass of water in his hand. His parents lived 2 states away. He hadn't seen them in over 2 years. Birthdays had passed in silence, calls unanswered, visits postponed with excuses about markets and mergers. He had told himself it was professionalism. In this moment, it felt like cowardice. The jet lights dimmed as the cabin crew prepared for the overnight stretch. The world outside had turned into a dark ocean, endless and depthless. Inside, Ethan scrolled through his messages. There it was, a hospital notification, Vermont Medical Center. For a second, he wondered if it was meant for him. Then he saw Claire's name. The update had been forwarded through her patient care proxy. He hesitated, then turned the phone so she could see. Her eyes scanned the message quickly. Condition stable, but worsening. Possible LVAD consideration within weeks. She read it once, then closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, she picked up her pen. On the corner of her notes, she wrote, "Prepare for overtime. No sigh. No collapse into grief." Just quiet recalibration, as though she had trained herself not to indulge in what she couldn't afford. Ethan stared at her, more unsettled by her composure than he would have been by tears. That's all he asked softly. She looked at him, her green eyes clear, unflinching. Worry doesn't change anything. Work pays the bills. For a long moment, Ethan couldn't answer. Something tightened in his chest. Not quite anger, not quite admiration. Maybe both. She wasn't numb. He could see the weight in her eyes, but she carried it differently, without self-pity, without demand. He leaned back, staring at the oval window. The Atlantic stretched below them, a vast blackness with no landmarks, no lights. His reflection looked back at him, lined with years of control and calculation. When did I stop caring about people? He wondered, the thought so sudden it almost startled him. The engines droned on, steady and relentless, carrying them closer to Iceland, farther from the lives they had both learned to postpone. Reykjavik welcomed them with sharp wind, steam rising from hidden springs, and a sky the color of steel. Ethan had been here before, yet this time the city felt different. Maybe because someone else was watching it beside him. From the window of the car that carried them from the airport, Claire leaned forward slightly, her eyes taking in every detail. Rows of colored rooftops huddled against the cold. Fishing boats bobbed in the harbor, steam curled upward from geothermal vents. She didn't speak much, but Ethan noticed the way she absorbed it, all the way her gaze lingered on people rather than buildings, on gestures rather than skylines. Their first meeting was at the Ministry of Industry, a room of polished oak and measured words. Officials spoke of renewable contracts, numbers stacked like dominoes. Ethan had done this before, many times. He knew how to present efficiency, profit margins, the allure of American investment, but when the talk shifted to land use, it was Claire who leaned forward. She listened as a gray-haired engineer spoke of an ancient cemetery lying near one of the proposed sites. His English was careful, but his meaning was clear disturbance that would fracture trust. Ethan would normally have filed it as a minor cultural concern. Claire did not. She asked for details, about the families who visited, about the rituals tied to that place. She didn't offer solutions, only listened until the man's shoulders eased. Ethan found himself silent, almost unsettled, watching her draw connection without strategy. Later that day, they stood near the docks, the smell of salt and fish thick in the air. A group of fishermen voiced their worries: would geothermal expansion damage the spawning grounds? Cut into their livelihood, Ethan had half expected Claire to shrink from their bluntness. Instead, she asked about their routines, the rhythm of the seasons, what mattered most to them. One man gestured with his calloused hands, speaking rapidly. Claire didn't interrupt. She only nodded, repeating back small details to show she had heard. Ethan realized he was seeing something foreign to his world negotiations, not as battles to be won, but as lives to be understood. That night, as rain turned to sleet against the hotel windows, Ethan reviewed the day's notes. Contracts and projections sat untouched on his desk. Instead, he replayed the look on the fishermen's faces when Claire acknowledged their fears. No pretense, no agenda, just recognition. His phone buzzed. Celeste. Again. This time the message carried no charm. Photo shoot next week. Engagement spread. No delays. Our calendars are already published. Another followed. If you care about perception, don't embarrass me by hesitating. Ethan let the screen dim without answering. The contrast cut sharper than ever. Celeste's words pressed like steel against the softness he had witnessed all day. The next morning, officials delivered new schedules. Meteorologists were predicting a storm, a heavy snowfront sweeping down from Greenland. If the forecast held, airports could close, roads could vanish under drifts. Travel might be delayed for days, maybe longer. Ethan stood at the hotel window, watching the first flakes streak sideways under the wind. The glass was cold beneath his fingertips. For years, he had prided himself on controlling markets, outcomes, appearances, but storms cared little for control. Behind him, Claire quietly organized papers, setting tomorrow's itinerary aside in case of cancellation. She didn't complain, she didn't fret, she simply adjusted, as if storms were an expected part of living. Ethan exhaled, fogging the glass. Maybe storms, he murmured, are the only way the world forces us to stop. Outside, Reykjavik's lights blurred through falling snow, and somewhere deep within him, Ethan felt the edges of a change he couldn't yet name. The road to the West Fjords twisted along cliffs that dropped into black water. By the time they reached the fishing town, the sky glowed faint green, the first trace of northern lights breaking through the storm. The village was small, its houses painted in colors that stood out against the bleak winter. Smoke rose from chimneys, carrying the smell of fish and wood. Children ran past in wool sweaters, their laughter carried by the wind. Claire wrapped her scarf tighter, but her eyes were wide, drinking in the life around her. Inside a low-roofed hall, fishermen gathered, their faces weathered by salt and storms. At the edge of the room sat a widow, her gray hair pulled back, her hands folded in her lap. Few people spoke to her. Yet Claire walked straight to her, lowering herself into the chair beside her, as if they had known each other for years. The widow spoke slowly, her voice soft, telling of her husband lost to a sudden storm, of sons who now carried the family's nets. Claire didn't interrupt. She asked about the man's favorite catch, about the songs he used to hum at sea. When the woman's eyes misted, Claire reached across and covered her hand gently. Ethan watched, uneasy. He was used to numbers, to negotiations measured in percentages, but here was something different, trust built not through power, but through presence. Later, as officials pressed for signatures, Ethan's phone buzzed again. Headlines scrolled across the screen. North Shore accused of greenwashing by rival consortium. The words sliced like ice. Investors demanded assurance. Stock tickers dipped. Celeste's message followed within minutes. Come back now. Protect the brand. The optics matter more than Iceland. Ethan set the phone aside, jaw tight. For years he had followed that rhythm image first, truth later, but when he looked at Claire, still speaking with the widow, still listening as if every word mattered, he hesitated. She returned to his side, notes in hand. They're offering contracts, she said softly, but it's not enough. They need safeguards protections for the fisheries, recognition of sacred land. If you sign now, it's profit, but not fairness. Ethan felt the old reflex rise. Close the deal, secure the numbers, silence the doubts. Yet something in Claire's tone stopped him. She wasn't asking for perfection. She was asking for patience. Not enough to call it just, she said, her voice steady. Not yet. Outside, the northern sky rippled. A curtain of green widened, deepened, until purple streaks broke through. The villagers stepped into the cold, their faces lit by the glow. Claire tilted her head back, wonder reflected in her eyes. Ethan followed her gaze. The aurora danced above them, restless and alive, as if reminding him that beauty belonged to those who waited. For the first time in years, he let the moment linger, unmeasured, unowned. He exhaled into the freezing air, watching his breath disappear into the night. Maybe light only came after the darkness had time to settle. Maybe the best decisions did, too. By nightfall, the wind screamed through the fjords. Snow buried the road faster than plows could clear it. The farmhouse they found was warm but powerless. Candles their only light. The windows rattled, the beams creaked, and every gust carried the sound of a world being stripped bare. Inside, Ethan sat at a rough wooden table, a wool blanket draped across his shoulders. His phone blinked with no signal, then caught a bar of service just long enough to flood with messages. The board, unsettled by rumors of delays, investors, warning of consequences, and Celeste, her words sharp as glass. If you don't return, I'll announce the wedding without you. He put the phone face down, his pulse tight in his temples. For once, he couldn't control the storm outside, or the storm inside his carefully built life. Claire moved through the room with a steadiness that drew every eye. She directed the villagers calmly, translating where she could, noting supplies, organizing shifts for tending fires. Her presence softened the edges of panic. Children sat quietly near the hearth because she read to them from memory lines of Frost and Dickinson carried into the dim glow, turning fear into something almost gentle. When she finished, she joined Ethan at the table, her breath visible in the cold. They'll need help once the storm clears, she said. Boats damaged, nets torn. They can't afford to wait for paperwork. He studied her face, lit by candlelight. The wind screamed outside, yet she spoke as if grounded in something stronger. He reached for his laptop, battery low but alive. Within minutes, he authorized an emergency fund, millions set aside for immediate aid. No approvals, no long debates. His board would rage. But for the first time in years, he didn't care. Claire watched quietly, then gave the smallest nod. It wasn't gratitude in her eyes, nor admiration. It was something rarer, trust. A gust slammed the shutters. The candles flickered wildly, shadows jumping across the walls. And then Claire's phone buzzed in her coat pocket. A single bar of service, enough for one call. Her hand trembled as she lifted it to her ear. Ethan watched the color drain from her face. It was the hospital in Vermont. Her father's condition had worsened. His heart was failing faster than expected. Surgeons were preparing for an emergency procedure. They urged family to come at once. Claire's breath caught, sharp and silent. She pressed a hand over her mouth, eyes glistening. The farmhouse seemed to still around her, the roar of the storm muffled by the weight of those words. Ethan leaned forward, his chest tightening. Candlelight trembled over her features, fragile yet unbroken. In that moment, he knew with certainty this trip was no longer about contracts or image. It was about something larger, something that would change everything he thought he understood about himself. The storm raged outside, but inside the farmhouse, silence weighed heavier than the wind. Claire stared at the dark phone screen, torn between panic for her father and the impossibility of leaving. The hospital's words still echoed emergency procedure. Come at once. Her hands clenched together in her lap. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to summon the calm she wore like armor. But Ethan, seated across the table, saw the truth in her trembling fingers and the tight line of her mouth. For years he had watched colleagues mask fear behind polished smiles. But this was different. Claire wasn't pretending for advantage. She was holding herself together because she didn't have the luxury to fall apart. The candle between them flickered, throwing long shadows across the rough walls. Ethan leaned forward. "We'll get you there," he said. She shook her head instantly. "The roads are closed, flights grounded, even if they weren't. The cost." His tone sharpened. "Your father is not a line item. He's your world." Claire blinked, caught off guard by the force in his voice. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as though the words she carried had no place in this room. Ethan pulled out his phone, scrolling past frozen notifications until he reached the number of his pilot. He typed with clipped precision, every keystroke a decision. Arrange medevac, Reykjavik base, immediate departure. Claire reached across the table, her hand brushing his wrist. "Ethan? No, it's reckless. The storm." He met her gaze, steady and unyielding. "I've bent governments for contracts. Claire, don't think I won't move a storm for you." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She looked away, toward the frost-laced window, as if the snow outside might offer an answer. Minutes passed, filled with the howl of wind and the muted sound of villagers shifting in the next room. Ethan spoke again, quieter this time. "Tell me what he means to you." Claire's throat tightened. She hadn't spoken of her father in detail, not here, not to him. Yet the question opened something she could no longer contain. "He's everything," she whispered. "When Mom died, he worked 2 jobs to keep me in school. He built shelves in the library so I'd always have books. Even when his heart weakened, he kept teaching me how to live, to be decent, to stand firm." Her voice broke, just slightly. "If I lose him now..." Ethan didn't let her finish. "Then you won't, not without a fight." He rose, striding toward the doorway where the village leader stood. In sharp, efficient words, he demanded passage to the nearest military airstrip. The man hesitated, citing the storm's danger. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then, "Send your best crew. I'll cover the cost. All of it." It wasn't a negotiation. It was command wrapped in urgency, fueled not by profit but by something raw. Within an hour, a rescue team prepared snowplows and tracked vehicles. Men bundled in the thick gear moved like shadows in the storm. Ethan oversaw each step, his phone pressed to his ear, issuing instructions to contacts in Reykjavik, forcing a path through bureaucracy as fiercely as others fought through snowdrifts. Claire stood in the farmhouse doorway, her scarf pulled tight, her heart pounding. She had seen him command boardrooms, bend markets, silence rivals, but never like this, never for something that gave him nothing in return. When the headlights of a snowplow cut through the white, she realized this wasn't corporate theater. This was sacrifice. Ethan turned to her, his hair damp from the storm, his eyes unyielding. "We leave now. You'll be in Vermont before dawn." Her voice wavered. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, filled only by the roar of engines outside. Then, softly but firmly, "Because some things matter more than contracts. And I won't let you face this alone." Claire pulled her coat tighter, stepping into the blizzard. Snow whipped against her face, stinging, blinding. And then the low thunder of rotors grew louder, a helicopter forcing its way through the storm. The machine loomed above them, lights piercing the swirling dark. Its blades churned the snow into a blinding halo. Villagers shielded their faces as the craft descended onto the field beyond. Claire gripped her coat, her heart racing. The cold bit through every layer, but deeper still was a shock she couldn't quite name. The man beside her, the billionaire carved from glass and steel, had risked everything not for a deal, not for a headline, but for her, and she couldn't yet decide which terrified her more, the storm around them, or the storm she felt within. At 20,000 feet, the storm fell away, leaving only moonlight on snow-capped peaks. Ethan looked across the narrow jet cabin and realized he could not stay silent any longer. The engines hummed steady, but inside him, nothing felt steady at all. Claire sat opposite, wrapped in a blanket the attendant had offered. Her face was pale from exhaustion, but her eyes were awake, restless. She kept glancing at her phone, though no signal reached them here above the Atlantic. Each glance was a silent prayer that time would stretch, that her father would hold on. Ethan's gaze lingered longer than he intended. He had spent his life in glass offices, in rooms where every word was calculated, every gesture rehearsed. Yet here, in the quiet of the cabin, calculation felt unbearable. "Claire," he said, his voice lower than the drone of the engines. She looked at him, waiting. He took a breath, steadying himself. "For years. I've lived in a marriage without vows. Celeste and I, what we had, it was never love. It was a contract, a merger of names and images. We smiled for cameras, spoke lines written by publicists, and I convinced myself that was enough." Claire's brows knit, as if she wasn't sure she had heard him right. Ethan pressed on, his words tumbling faster than usual. "But these past days with you..." He stopped, searching for words he hadn't used in decades. "For the first time in 10 years, I felt alive. Not powerful, not successful, alive." The cabin seemed to shrink with the weight of his admission. Claire's lips parted, but no words came. She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the low thrum of the engines. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but trembling. "Do you understand what you're saying? You're my employer. I depend on this job. I depend on the insurance. If this goes wrong, I lose everything." Her honesty struck harder than anger would have. She wasn't playing coy. She was afraid of hope, of risk, of the cost of believing someone who could walk away untouched. Ethan leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "I'm not calculating. Claire, not this time. I'm telling you the truth because I can't not tell you." She shook her head, eyes glistening. "I've already built my life around loss, around waiting for my father's heart to give out, around scraping hours together to cover bills. I don't have room for another person promising things they can't keep." Her voice cracked. "Don't say this unless you mean it, because I can't survive another person leaving." Tears broke free, and she turned her face toward the oval window, hiding in the reflection of the moonlit clouds. Ethan's chest ached. For years, he had been the man people feared disappointing, the man who decided contracts and destinies. Now, he was the one terrified of failing, terrified of adding to the burden she already carried. Slowly, carefully, he reached across the narrow aisle and covered her hand with his. Her fingers tensed, then loosened under his touch. "I mean it," he said, his voice no longer the clipped authority of a CEO, but something gentler, almost raw. "I don't know where this leads. I don't know what storms are ahead, but I know this. I want to walk through them with you, not without you." Claire turned back toward him, her eyes searching his face. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, quietly, she whispered, "I don't know if I can believe that yet." Ethan nodded. "Then let me prove it, not with words. With what I choose, with what I give up, with how I stay." The engines carried them higher, the moonlight pouring into the cabin. Claire's tears glimmered, not hidden now, but unashamed. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't speaking as a CEO or as a man trapped in a perfect engagement. He was speaking as someone rediscovering his heart. The Manhattan skyline glittered like a crown as the jet descended. To Ethan, it had never looked so hollow. For Claire, it meant facing hospitals, bills, and a decision she could no longer delay. The city roared back into their lives with its endless horns, its lights burning as if night were optional. Claire barely spoke as the car carried her straight from the airport to Vermont Medical Center's New York affiliate, where her father had been transferred for the surgery. Ethan followed, but she stopped him at the entrance. "This is family," she said quietly, her hand gripping the strap of her bag. "I need to go in alone." He wanted to argue. Every instinct pushed him to stay, to carry her burden. But the look in her eyes told him this wasn't about him. It was about a daughter and her father, a space too sacred for an outsider. He nodded, watching her disappear through the sliding doors, her figure swallowed by the sterile glow of the hospital. Hours stretched. Ethan sat in the waiting room, his suit rumpled, his phone untouched. Around him, families whispered prayers, clutched coffee cups, stared at screens that gave no answers. He felt the weight of helplessness settle over him, heavier than any boardroom defeat. When at last Claire emerged, her face was pale but steady. "He made it through the first stage," she whispered. Relief trembled in her voice. "They'll monitor him overnight." Ethan reached for her hand, but she pulled back gently. "Go, rest. I need to stay." And so he left, carrying with him the ache of a man who had been allowed only to watch from the edges. The next morning, Ethan returned to his office tower. The glass walls gleamed. The lobby echoed with the sound of polished shoes. But the place felt colder than the Icelandic storm. His desk was stacked with urgent memos, his inbox flooded with headlines about North Shore's stalled deal. And waiting for him in the corner office was Celeste. She stood by the window, her reflection as sharp as the skyline behind her. She didn't turn when he entered. "You disappeared," she said, her tone calm, controlled, but carrying a blade beneath. "Do you have any idea what that cost us?" Ethan closed the door. "I know what it cost me to stay." Finally, she turned. Her eyes were cool, her smile practiced. "We were supposed to be photographed in Napa this week. The story was ready. Investors expected reassurance. And instead, you chose." Her gaze narrowed. Ethan didn't flinch. Celeste stepped closer, her perfume sharp, her heels clicking like punctuation marks. "Do you think I don't see it? The way you look at her, the way you defy me for her?" Her voice dropped, edged with venom. "She's nothing, a hired assistant with a sick father. Do you really think the world will forgive you for throwing this away for her?" He met her glare, steady. "I'm not asking the world for forgiveness. I'm asking myself." Her laugh was short, bitter. "Then you've doomed yourself, because I won't protect her. In fact, I'll ruin her." A whisper to the right magazine. A story planted in the right column, she'll be painted as the woman who destroyed an empire. And you know how fast a reputation can collapse. For years, Ethan had bowed to that logic. Perception first, truth later, but not now. Not anymore. "I'm done." "Celeste," he said quietly. Her eyes widened, just for a fraction of a second. Then she tilted her head, smiling as if he were a naive child. "Done. You don't walk away from me. Ethan, you don't walk away from us. We are power. We are brand. Without me, you're vulnerable. Then so be it." His voice was steady, each word deliberate. "I won't marry you. Not for image, not for empire, not for anything." The silence stretched, sharp as glass. Then Celeste's smile returned, colder this time. "Then watch how fast I destroy her." Her words lingered long after she left the office, her heels clicking down the marble hall like a closing door. That evening, Ethan returned to his penthouse. The lights of Manhattan glittered below, as relentless as ever. He stood among the sleek furniture, the polished steel, the art chosen by decorators. For the first time, it all looked foreign, empty. He loosened his tie, set his phone on the counter, and let the silence wash over him. Celeste was gone. The empire trembled, and yet, beneath the weight of loss, there was something else, an unfamiliar sense of freedom. Still, as he stood alone against the glass wall, one truth pressed hardest. Freedom had never felt so lonely. Hospitals smelled of bleach and broken hope. Ethan found Claire in the chapel, her hands clasped not in prayer but in exhaustion. The stained glass windows filtered thin winter light, scattering muted colors across the worn wooden pews. She looked smaller here, not the calm professional who had steered him through Iceland, but a daughter whose strength was fraying. When she lifted her head, her eyes were red, though her voice tried to hold steady. "She came," Claire whispered. Ethan didn't need to ask who. Celeste. She continued, almost choking on the name. "She found me in the cafeteria, sat across from me like she owned the air. She offered money enough to cover my father's treatment for years. All I had to do was disappear." Her hands trembled as she uncurled them. When I refused, she smiled, said she could make one phone call and paint me as the woman who seduced her fiancé for financial security, said no company would touch me again. "And if I lose this job," Claire swallowed hard, "if I lose the insurance, my father?" Her voice broke. Ethan felt his chest tighten with a fury he could barely contain. He had built a life managing numbers, mergers, risks. But here was a risk no calculation could neutralize the fragile thread tying Claire's world to survival. "Let me take care of you both," he said, his voice low, desperate. Claire shook her head sharply. "That's not how it works. Ethan, I can't just accept charity. I won't put myself or my father in a position where people whisper that everything we have comes from your pity." "This isn't pity," he said, stepping closer. His shadow fell across her, but his voice softened. "It's love." The word hung between them like thunder in the quiet chapel. Claire blinked, stunned. Ethan drew in a shaky breath. "I've spent years in a relationship that was a contract, a merger dressed as romance. With you, Claire, I feel alive, not for the cameras, not for the investors, for myself, for the first time in decades. I want something real." Her lips parted, trembling. "Ethan." He lowered himself onto the pew beside her, his hands open, not demanding. "Marry me, not to silence Celeste, not to shield your reputation. Marry me because I love you, because I want to spend every morning for the rest of my life remembering what it feels like to be human again." Claire's breath came fast, shallow. Tears welled in her eyes as if fighting to stay hidden. "This is insane," she whispered. "Your world and mine, they don't fit. You're a billionaire CEO. I'm an assistant who left teaching to pay hospital bills. You can't mean this." "I do." His voice cracked, raw. "I mean it more than I've meant anything. I don't care about the empire. I don't care about the press. I care about you, and your father, and the chance to build something true, even if the world calls it reckless." For a long moment, silence filled the chapel, the hum of fluorescent lights, the muffled page of a Bible turning in some corner. Claire pressed her hands to her face, her shoulders shaking. "You don't understand," she said finally, her words muffled by her palms. "I can't survive another person leaving. Not after my mother, not after watching my father fight every day. If you say this and then walk away—" Ethan reached out, gently lowering her hands from her face. "I won't. I swear to you. Claire, I am here for all of it. The sleepless nights, the medical bills, the storms we can't control. I want them with you, only with you." Her tears spilled freely now, her defenses crumbling under the weight of his words. The chapel blurred for her, colors bleeding together in stained glass haze. She had lived so long, calculating every choice, playing safe, clinging to stability, and yet, in this fragile, impossible moment, she felt something stronger than fear. Hope. Her lips trembled as she searched his eyes. Not the polished mask of a CEO, not the calculated calm of a strategist, but the man underneath, stripped bare, offering his heart without armor. Life was short, too short for safety. "Yes," she whispered. The word was barely sound, more breath than speech. But Ethan heard it with his whole soul. His eyes closed for an instant, as though anchoring himself in the gravity of that single syllable. When he opened them again, He was smiling, not the distant, polite smile of photographs, but something raw and luminous. He gathered her hands into his, holding them like they were the most fragile, most precious thing he had ever touched. "You've just changed my life," he said softly. Claire let out a broken laugh, part sob, part relief. "No, Ethan, you've changed mine." For the first time in years, the chapel seemed less like a room of fear and more like a sanctuary. The faint glow of stained glass painted their joined hands in colors neither had noticed before, shades of promise, of beginnings. Beyond those walls, the world would rage, scandals would brew, Celeste would plot, the press would feast. But here, in this quiet, fragile space, they had chosen each other, and nothing could undo that. 6 months later, the wedding that broke headlines wasn't the one splashed across society pages. It was a garden tucked behind a hospital, where 30 people gathered under string lights that swayed in the summer breeze. There were no velvet aisles, no towering arrangements of imported flowers, just folding chairs borrowed from the hospital cafeteria, mason jars filled with wildflowers, and a small wooden arch draped in white linen. Yet, to Ethan, it was more beautiful than any ballroom he had ever stepped into. Claire stood at the center, her dress simple, altered from one her mother had worn decades earlier. The fabric carried the faint scent of cedar from old trunks, and it fit her like a story being told again in a new voice. She had no veil, no glittering jewels, only the calm grace that came from surviving storms and still choosing love. Ethan adjusted his tie with unsteady fingers. His suit was dark, but his vows, written on a scrap of paper folded into his pocket, were the truest words he had ever prepared. For a man used to speeches measured in market impact, this one was different. Every line came from his heart, not his boardroom. In the front row sat Claire's father, color back in his cheeks after the transplant that had once seemed impossible. He clutched a tissue in one hand, the other resting over the steady beat of his new heart. His eyes never left his daughter, pride and gratitude mingling in a way that words could never hold. Around them, friends and family shifted quietly. Nurses who had tended to Claire's father. A few colleagues who had stood by Ethan when the scandal broke. People who mattered not because of their titles, but because of their presence. The scandal had indeed broken wide. Headlines had screamed of betrayal, forbidden romance, power imbalance. But then the narrative shifted. Photographs of Ethan walking Claire through hospital corridors. Interviews where he spoke not of profits, but of promises. In a world jaded by image, people saw something raw, something real, and against all odds, they rooted for it. Celeste had not weathered the storm. Her contracts dissolved. Her influence waned. Her empire of curated perfection collapsed under the weight of its own hollowness. She disappeared from the headlines she once commanded, but none of that mattered here. Not in this garden, not under these lights. When it came time for vows, Ethan unfolded the paper, his voice trembling at first, then steadying. "When I hired you," he began, his gaze fixed on Claire, "I thought I was getting an assistant. What I found was the person who reminded me what life was for. You showed me the difference between having everything and having something worth having. Today, standing here, I am the richest man alive because I have you." Claire's lips quivered as tears slipped down her cheeks. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently before speaking. "You made me want to be brave," she said softly. "Not just brave enough to love you, but brave enough to believe I deserve to be loved. For years, I thought survival was enough, but you've taught me to live, and I promise to spend my days making sure we never forget what that feels like." A hush fell. Even the children fidgeting in the back seemed still, as though the weight of those words pressed against the evening air. The officiant nodded, his own voice warm with quiet reverence. And now, the rings. Ethan lifted the simple gold band, sliding it onto Claire's finger with hands that no longer shook. He leaned close, whispering words only she could hear. For the first time, He murmured, "I have everything." Claire's tears turned into a trembling smile as she placed the second ring on his hand. The officiant's voice rose again. "By the love you've spoken and the vows you've given, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The garden erupted in applause, not the polite clapping of gala audiences, not the stage cheers of corporate events, but something pure, joyous, every hand meeting not for a brand, but for love. Ethan pulled Claire into his arms, kissing her gently, as string lights swayed above them and laughter filled the night air. For the first time, neither of them felt alone. 2 years later, spring returned to Iceland. The northern lights shimmered above the same fjords where a storm had once trapped them. But this time, Ethan and Claire arrived not as CEO and assistant, not as two people caught between duty and longing, but as husband and wife. The air carried the same sharp salt from the sea, the same clean bite of mountain wind. Yet to them, everything felt different. Life had shifted since those uncertain days. What had once been fragile now felt rooted, steady, like the basalt cliffs rising from the water. They visited the fishing village where Claire had sat with widows and children by candlelight. Now, the harbor brimmed with new boats powered by clean energy systems North Shore had helped install. The docks smelled of fresh paint, not despair. Fishermen waved, their nets strong and full, their eyes grateful. Ethan shook hands, no longer with the distance of a man calculating return on investment, but as someone who understood the weight of promises kept. Claire spoke with the women, asking about families, schools, and the rhythm of the seasons. They remembered her, not as an executive's assistant, but as the woman who had listened when no one else did. Later, walking the narrow road along the cliffs, Ethan pulled Claire close against the chill. "They don't look at me like a CEO anymore," he said quietly. "No." Claire smiled. "They look at you like a man who showed up." She wasn't wrong. He had changed. North Shore still thrived, but Ethan no longer lived in its shadow. He left the office at 5. Every Friday marked family time. Meetings were shorter. His team, once drained, found balance too. Success no longer meant more hours, more pressure. It meant alignment with values, with people, with what truly mattered. Claire had changed as well. Her book, Authentic Leadership, had climbed bestseller lists. It wasn't a manual of strategies, but a woven story of listening, empathy, and courage, the very things she had carried in her leather portfolio the first day she walked into his office. Letters from readers arrived weekly, stories of managers who dared to lead with kindness instead of fear. They sat that evening on a wooden bench facing the open fjord. The sun dipped, and twilight stretched long, as it does in Icelandic spring. Claire leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder. "Do you remember that flight?" she asked. "How could I forget?" His eyes softened. 14 hours of silence and questions I didn't even know I had. "You reading poetry like it was a map through the storm." She laughed gently. "You thought it was manipulative at first." "I did." He tilted his head, brushing her temple with his lips. "But it turned out to be the first thing that made me feel alive." The sky darkened, and then it began the slow unfurling of the aurora. Threads of green shimmered, then deepened into ribbons of violet and gold. The colors moved like breath, like whispered music, sweeping across the heavens. Claire's hand tightened around his. "It's different every time," she whispered. "Like us," Ethan said. "Never the same, always changing, but always here." For a long moment, they sat in silence, their breaths visible in the cold, their hearts steady with gratitude. The storm that had once trapped them had felt like disaster. But now they saw it for what it was, the turning point, the pause life had forced upon them so they could choose differently. Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out a small wrapped package. Claire raised an eyebrow. Surprised. "What's this?" "Something I found months ago," he said. His voice trembled slightly. "I wanted to wait until we were here again." She untied the twine carefully. Inside lay a first edition of Icelandic poetry, the same collection she had read from on that flight, the one that had begun their first true conversation. She opened the cover and found his inscription in careful handwriting. "For the woman who taught me love is the only true energy." Claire pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes bright with tears. "Ethan, I spent years chasing power, control, markets," he said softly. "But none of it compares to this, to you, to what we've built." Her tears slipped free, falling onto the page. She closed the book and leaned into him, her voice breaking. "You gave me back more than I ever dreamed I could have." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her against the sweep of the northern sky. Above them, the aurora flared brighter, as if answering their vow, not of wealth or achievement, but of presence. The world would keep moving. Storms would come again, in different forms, but they had chosen each other once, and they would keep choosing, every day, in small acts of tenderness, in decisions to listen, in promises kept in the quiet. The aurora shimmered, painting them in light. Ethan kissed Claire's forehead and whispered, "Here's to the journey, whatever comes next." Claire closed her eyes, letting the colors wash over her. "It's not an ending," she murmured. "It's the beginning of everything." And under the vast Icelandic sky, they held each other, two lives once fractured, now whole while the lights danced above, eternal and unplanned, just like love. In the end, this story is not just about a billionaire or an assistant. It is about the choices we all face between safety and truth, between what looks perfect and what feels real. Ethan had wealth, status, and a future planned to the last detail, but none of it gave him peace. Claire carried burdens, fears, and the weight of responsibility, but she also carried authenticity, kindness, and quiet courage. Their journey reminds us that storms in life are not meant only to test us. Sometimes they stop us long enough to see what truly matters. Love, family, and integrity cannot be measured in contracts or bank accounts. They are built in the small moments, listening when no one else will, standing beside someone in their darkest hour, daring to believe in second chances. For those of us who have lived long enough to know loss, the lesson is clear. Life is too short to settle for empty comfort. Real happiness comes when we choose love over fear, presence over appearances, and meaning over success. It's never too late to choose differently, and to find that the heart can still be renewed. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need its message, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more heartfelt stories to you. See you in the next chapter.